Welcome to Assessment in Focus, the podcast where we invite guests to tell us the real stories of digital assessment transformation, innovation and enhancement. Flexible assessment with integrity is a shared goal between higher education and Inspira, so we're here to discover how institutions around the world are assessing today and beyond. I'm your host, Ishan Global Client Evangelist at Inspira, and today I'm joined by Phil and Svetlana from the University of Reading. Phil, Svetlana, hello, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Hello.
Let me tell you a little bit more about our guest today. So, Phil Smyth is the Deputy Director of Academic English Assessment at the International Study and Language Institute at the University of Reading. His role is to support the Director and lead on various test and assessment related activities, both within the International Study and Language Institute and with external stakeholders and partner institutions and other organisations internationally. Svetlana is a language teacher and assessment specialist with 24 years of experience teaching English to international students. For the past couple of years, she's been working as an academic English lecturer and Director of Assessment at the International Study and Language Institute at the University of Reading. So a little bit about both of you, but I wondered, Svetlana, if you can tell our listeners a little bit about the University of Reading, please.
Sure, Ishan. So the University of Reading is one of the top UK universities. We are located in the southeast of the UK, and we have a range of academic programs. We're probably best known for our environmental science, agriculture and meteorology programs. And we have a beautiful green campus that has won the Green Flag Award for the past 14 years. And we've got a lot of international students from 160 countries. So it's a great place to be working in.
Absolutely, sounds absolutely great. Now, I've been to Reading several times in my old life as a barrister, but never to the university. So I'm going to take this as an opportunity to invite myself next time Fiona comes down to see you. I've got some questions that I want to ask both of you today as we look at how education and assessment is continuously evolving and improving. And the first question I've got really relates to that subject. So, as higher education evolves, and I think we're really seeing a concentrated period of involvement at the moment, what do you see as the most critical changes needed in assessment practices to better align students with the skills they need in the future? And Phil, I'll come to you first on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd start by thinking a bit about what Svetlana and I do, which is largely with the international student community. And I think a big thing for us, obviously, is looking at communication skills of international students, both in Reading, but also outside of Reading, perhaps wanting to come to Reading to study. I think one of the big sort of things that we want to be able to do is to assess people's communication skills digitally, because this is the sort of thing that they're going to be doing in the future. And I think that there's a sort of tension we find that there's a sort of a move in some parts to try and move people back into an exam hall and maybe handwrite answers, which doesn't really work for us if we see ourselves as trying to support students improving their communication skills using all the tools available that they have, working on computers, working digitally. That sort of tension, I think, is a bit of a problem. So I think that's a big change in a way, and in some ways I think we're moving in the right direction. In other ways I think perhaps we're not, but I don't know if Svetlana would add anything to that.
I would certainly agree with what Phil has been saying. I think we are faced with the task of maybe pausing and taking stock and redefining the constructs that we're trying to target in our assessments, because the nature of what students do in the classroom, but also what they're going to be doing in their working life is so different. They're going to be functioning in a very multimedia and technology driven world. So we're having to think about, for example, if we're assessing students' reading skills, how representative is the task of what we are trying, what they're going to be doing in the real world. So yeah, we're grappling with that. And I think, yes, I can echo what Phil has been saying about the importance of digital assessment literacy, not only for the staff, but also for the students. And I think probably when we look at the graduate attributes and the way the universities are redefining them, our university, for instance, is placing just as much importance on the students' self-efficacy skills and their ability to manage themselves and to be proactive, as long, alongside their subject matter knowledge. So I think maybe that will make formative assessments more important, especially with the availability of some AI tools where students can produce a piece of work, then generate feedback for themselves and act on that feedback and kind of approach it in a more independent way, not always looking to the teacher to give them some feedback and support their assessment work.
Absolutely. I think that I certainly know from when I was teaching that not universally, but a large body of students, or maybe most of them over a distinct period of time, align what they're willing to learn to the assessment that's coming up. And so if we're able to bake digital literacy into assessment, it gives it a tangible point for them to want to get more involved with it. And as a follow-up to both of you, a question about what that digital literacy is. We certainly see that the 18, 19-year-olds of today are very digitally literate in particular areas, but perhaps not the same as ours. I've mentioned on a previous episode that my 18-year-old was impressed with my Excel skills, which is great because I pride myself on my Excel skills. To what extent do we need to teach, if we're thinking about that community, particularly of 18, 19-year-olds starting university, to what extent do we need to teach them skills that perhaps older generations do have when it comes to digital literacy, which are important for their assessment and their wider skills, or do they actually have them? What's your experience been? Svetlana, I'll come to you first on that one.
I think I'm glad you've asked this question because we work with a very diverse student population. We have students coming from different countries and their digital assessment literacy levels are very different. And this also depends on the levels or the parity of access to digital assessment tools or digital tools in general. So I think what we found from our experience of implementing online and digital assessment is that you cannot assume digital literacy in younger population despite the common kind of perception. So I think we are leaning towards providing as much training and student familiarization with the online assessment tools as we can.
Yeah, really, really important. We've certainly seen across our customer base, and certainly me, because I was an Inspira user before I worked here, that level of information and the number of opportunities you provide the student to look at the environment so that their concern is fully on the exam or assessment in front of them and not the technology really sort of pays dividends. I frequently say to institutions, if you're going to run a practice exam, definitely don't put your cognate subject in there because then they'll focus on the questions you've just asked. I used to write practice exams that were about cheese, and that way people would just focus on the environment and not my really quite strong views on different cheeses. We might get to that later in the episode. Phil, I've taken us down the cheese tangent, my apologies, but on that point about digital literacy and how it might differ, certainly Svetlana made the point about parity of access and what people have in different countries. You've got a student body that spans the globe. What extent have you found that affects their literacy or their access?
Yeah, I think Svetlana's right. I think we do see some students, I think, who I would say are very digitally literate, and others far less so. And I think sort of thinking a bit from the other side about sort of staff members and teachers and their literacy levels, I think we sometimes have a lot to learn from the students. And certainly, I'm speaking personally here, students who've helped me see what some of the tools are, what some of the tools available to students are and how they utilize them. I think that's where we need to be quite open in sort of classroom settings to sort of see, to build sort of trust, to let them show you how they're tackling assignments. What are they actually doing? What sort of software and so on are they using? What sort of apps are they using? And I think without that, I would probably, no matter how much you read, you're a bit in the dark, perhaps, of how students go about tackling an assignment. What are they actually bringing to it that we wouldn't have thought about ourselves? So one just final point there. I think I just want to mention Svetlana's Excel skills are also very good. So far better than mine.
Good. I feel we'll come to AI later in the podcast, but I feel like I've slightly been usurped by the fact that AI is pretty good at writing Excel formulae, and I used to pride myself on those. But we'll come to that. You're right about the tools, Phil. I know that speaking to a student body several years ago when I was teaching and talking about things like a community, there was one part of the student body who said, WhatsApp's our community. That's the easiest thing. I don't want something I have to log into. It's on my phone. It's here. And that availability of it was so important to them. And certainly talking to students and finding out what they use and why gives us real insight into what we might deploy for them. We've sort of touched on this as we've gone through that first question. My next one is, in your experience, what is the most significant barrier to digital transformation in higher education assessment in particular, and how can institutions overcome it? And I want to preface the question by saying what we're commonly asked when we speak to institutions around the world is, how are other people doing it? And I think sometimes they just need to hear, we're all facing the same challenges, it's hard, this is how we do it. So not expecting a silver bullet that then ends the podcast because we've got the greatest answer in the world. Actually, just some real lived experiences. So Phil, coming to you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on one of the things I would say there as a barrier is that sort of fear of this is going to be a whole lot of work. Are we ready to do this? Do we know enough about it before taking the plunge, making a decision to sort of do something strategically quite different to perhaps what we were doing before? I think obviously related to that is probably cost as a barrier. Certainly, while I don't think the sort of Inspira, for example, is particularly a barrier in terms of cost. I think in terms of the IT support and other institutional factors, other institutional costs that you might have to consider in terms of training and members of staff available to support when people have problems, I think those can sort of sometimes be seen as barriers. In terms of overcoming it, I think you've already touched on something that I think is certainly been very useful to Svetlana and I, which is the opportunity to talk to others, see what others are doing, sort of be able to tell them our problems and see if these are common problems or it's just something unique to our context. So, I think those have been things. I think somehow building that community of knowing other institutions are doing the same kind of things. They have similar issues to you and you're not unique. And, I think there is support and so on out there, but trying to get people together to kind of discuss and talk about them, I think is a key way of overcoming that.
Very much so. Getting people in a room or virtual room is half the challenge, but often the big bit that then unlocks far more. Svetlana, same question. What's the most significant barrier or a different one you want to talk about, and how people can
I think I agree with what Phil has been saying. I think the obvious constraints are always financial or practical, for instance, the cost of the new solution or the complexity of integrating it with a lot of other university systems, because usually there are some really long-term contracts in place, and if the new system doesn't align seamlessly, that might become a barrier. But I think probably what we found on our year-long pilot of Inspira is the biggest challenge is the change management, because there can be some understandable resistance to new solutions because, as Phil said, that there is more work related to it. There's no hiding it. There's always some investment required for that. But I also think that there's also a variety of assessment practices, and we're not only talking about online practices but also offline practices, so in the classroom, and also summative paper assessment. So very often it's quite challenging to find a solution that would meet the needs of very different population groups, and there can be some resistance. So I think we found that if you are able to show that the solution is flexible and it can meet the needs of multiple academic groups, that you're more likely to overcome that resistance. Yes. And I think, yes, just in terms of resources, I think the current environment in the HE, in the higher education sectors, especially in the UK, makes a lot of people reluctant to commit to new um, software or new digital technology. I think one way of overcoming it is running a small pilot the way we have done it and showing tangible efficiencies in terms of saving marking time with automated marking, or showing other ways some administrative efficiencies or test design efficiencies can be found.
Yeah, people seeing the proof of the pudding. It's we've seen that. I saw it when I was deploying the software too at the institution that I worked, and there is, as you talk about the change management of people having to use something new, making that as simple as possible and showing them the benefits. We're 5 years on from COVID, but the change management people had to go through very rapidly. I don't think we've all forgotten it. I don't think it's as raw maybe as it was a couple of years ago, but maybe we've got to be more mindful of the fact that people have undergone quite a bit of change in that period of time. And on that subject of change, it's impossible to talk about education at the moment without talking about AI. I think it's impossible to talk about almost anything without talking about AI. It's such a pervasive topic in our lives. I want to look at a question which is, I know, as a former lawyer, is completely loaded. The actual question, the start of it, but it's the second part that's probably the interesting bit. So, do you think the rise of digital tools and AI has changed how we define and ensure academic integrity? And I'm sure everyone watching is shouting yes at the screen. But if so, how? So it's the how I'm really after here. The impact of AI on academic integrity and how we both define and ensure it. Where do you see that? Svetlana, you first.
I think I would also say yes, definitely. I think the first thing that comes to mind is the rise of the AI has prompted universities and institutions to be more explicit about what they expect in terms of academic integrity. So it's kind of, we've had to redefine the concept of academic misconduct. And as a consequence, our definition of the academic integrity has become more concrete, I think. So, for example, at our university, we have divided our assessment into three categories depending on the stance on AI. For example, there are assessments where you are not allowed to use AI at all, so that would be academic misconduct. There are assessments where you're allowed to use AI formatively while preparing for the assessment, and then there are some assessments where you're required to use AI in order to demonstrate your AI literacy skills. So depending on the type of the assessment, the definition of the academic misconduct will be different, and the definition of what you are required to demonstrate your academic integrity would be different. I think another thing that comes to mind is that having AI tools, for example, such as proctoring tools, has given us more evidence of what constitutes possible academic misconduct or poor academic practice. I think we've gained real insights through reviewing INSPIRE proctoring logs and data into what kind of behavior students might engage in, and also that has given us ideas on how we can then put those maybe insights into the student training
Yes.
and how we help them to avoid academic misconduct.
Well, it's that feedback loop that's really important. I think I'm hearing from lots of institutions the same as that you've said, which is AI has required us to be more concrete in our definition of academic integrity, academic misconduct. And that's probably no bad thing because, particularly where you have a diverse student body from lots of different cultures and backgrounds, being really clear with them rather than saying, well, you should just know this, because the you should just know might differ from country to country to culture, is is a positive for the students. I'm really heartened to hear that Reading have gone to that level because I think it's great for students. Phil, turning to you, what else can we be doing here? What else do we need to look at to in what is an ever evolving world to help students and academics understand where that line is?
It's a really difficult question. I think if I was answering it, I think defining, maybe I wouldn't change the definition very much, but I think Svetlana's already made the point that it's the enactment of the definition which, I think has changed quite a lot. I think we could probably pinpoint how students might have got away with sort of misconduct more easily before, and perhaps that's more problematic now. So I think certainly in terms of how we ensure it, I think there's definitely a lot of changes. I think Svetlana has already touched on key things for us in terms of what we do when assessments are sort of supervised and AI is not permitted. I think that some of the tools that we have available now that we didn't have before, I think are invaluable. And Svetlana's already touched on the proctoring data, which I think we're still working with now, but I think has been very useful. I think just a word on sort of AI detection tools, which we haven't found useful, and I'm not sure really that we ever will. In a sense, there are obviously problems with how reliably you can detect whether something's been written by AI or written by a human. But I think sort of beyond that, for me, as somebody sort of quite interested in learning-oriented assessment, the sort of the black box nature of a number or a likelihood that something's been written by a computer or not makes it very difficult to talk to students about what may have occurred here and what you might do differently and what you might change. And I think that is even if it could be shown to work reliably, I still think that's a bit of a problem, unlike sort of Turnitin software where you can say, well, there's the match, and you can sort of work on how you can paraphrase that better. I think in some way the proctoring laws could potentially have some of that use as well, of sort of once we see how students are attempting to address things, how do they go about answering questions, what's their sort of behavior, there's potential there for some feedback, I think, and that's not something we've looked at yet, but I'm sort of quite interested in that possibility in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said at the start of the podcast, we see this as flexible assessment with integrity is what people want in education, be they an academic, an administrator, a student, or indeed us as Inspira. And we see the future of integrity being the ability to use Inspira Originality, our similarity checker, Inspira Proctoring, and that doesn't mean everything on every assessment. It actually means the data from your Inspira assessment, the data from Inspira Originality if you're using similarity, from Proctoring if you're using it, but taking that data, those data sources together for it to be less of the black box, as you say, and more of a holistic picture of what integrity looks like. Because that's going to differ from assessment to assessment, from module to module, from different institutions, and as you say, even within that, which policy you've got on what is permitted in this or not. It used to be the old world of open book or closed book. We're now probably beyond that. We're also all using those terms differently. So yeah, seeing all of that together, I very much agree with both of you that the desire to better understand is hugely important, and there's a real appetite for it. And I'm going to plug our own white paper and research on this last year, which is on our website. I spent a year talking to educators around the globe on what they wanted from AI, specifically educators. The results are really interesting, but it also brought to the fore this, I just want to know what it's doing, which is part of that bigger picture. And as we look into the future, one of the big topics we're looking at this year is the future of assessment. Where's it going? I've been involved in, I started as an academic in 2011. Assessment's always been the bit that's most interesting to me. And with the availability of digital tools and people's own desire to use them increasing, there's lots that we can do. So what do you see as the future of assessment, and what role do digital tools play within that? Svetlana, I'll come to you first on this one.
I think probably I see the future of assessment moving towards diversifying. I think there's place for both offline and traditional assessment also digital assessment, and I think the increasing flexibility of digital assessment will probably attract more and more academics working on both formative and summative assessment. And I think also I see digital assessment as empowering for students. So just going back to that concept of being self-sufficient and as a graduate, I think there's a great potential for using more feedback tools and AI generated feedback to support your own learning. I think that's really great. And I think maybe there might be a revival of I guess secure assessment with the greater availability and improvement in the online security tools such as the lockdown browsers and proctoring, because there are some cases where we really need to be able to assess the knowledge, especially for us, we're working in language assessment. And so I think I would see these as probably the most important changes for our practice.
Yeah, no, it's hard for me to sort of differentiate a bit from what Svetlana said. I mean, I agree. I think that I also see this sort of diet of assessment, if we can call it that, being quite diversified. And I think Reading's idea of these sort of three different types of assessment, I think, points to that, although I don't think institutionally they're there yet. This idea of something unaided, lockdown, unsupervised, very, very tightly supervised, what can you do unaided versus something where you're getting support from AI versus something where you're having to use AI. And that third kind, I think we don't have very much at the moment. I don't think there's a lot of assessment where students are being asked to use AI, generate AI outputs as part of the assessment. I think that's going to be a growth area for sure. I think we're going to see more and more assessments that prompt students to do that. The other bit, perhaps, that we don't do very well at the moment is the first bit, funnily enough. Apart from getting students from the exam hall, that sort of what they can do unaided, I think, in the age of AI is perhaps a little bit. I'm trying to find the right word for it. We don't do that well enough. I think I'm minded a little bit by Philip Dawson, who's written a lot about sort of assessment integrity, particularly digital assessment integrity, and he talks about sort of being 3 years away from a Daily Mail expose about how students have got through university using just AI tools and not really done any sort of thinking for themselves. And so I think getting that balance right, I can see the need for all of those kinds of assessment, but making sure that the balance is sort of theoretically sound. There's a good balance of the three different kinds there, and that that potentially will give us a much richer picture of student ability to be able to see what they can do in each of those three domains. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think up to now, I think authentic assessment has had to do quite a lot of heavy lifting. That's I can't remember what somebody called it, a thought terminating cliche almost, that because things were authentic, that made it all okay, and we didn't need to worry about anything else. And I think that's I think there's a move away a bit from that now. Obviously, authenticity is one important characteristic of assessments, but there are a lot of others as well. And I think a better balance, a better diet of assessment, I think in the future, I think is going to be a good thing.
I agree, and I wonder, as we diversify a bit, and we're not just talking about authentic assessment, but we see a place for it, whether that is actually AI's place for it, because we are, as human beings, using AI more and more, either overtly or not realizing it in some of the things that we do. And maybe that authenticity is the involvement of AI. And so if we compare and contrast against the pure knowledge assessments, where actually I want the content of someone's mind, versus something that's more authentic, where I actually want to see what they would do anyway. At a conference last year and the year before, I asked people, do you want to do more authentic assessment? Do you use AI in your everyday life? Would you permit a student to use AI? And the answers differed last year and the year before, but there was that divergence between what I do and what I consider authentic. But I think, back to the black box, as we see more and more of what it's doing and understanding it, and we're more comfortable with it, I think our use of it will change, and maybe it'll find its right place, or it will find its right place. So turning then to the year that you've had using Inspira, again, people want to know how other people have done it and what they've done. What lessons have you learned from integrating Inspira into your work, and what advice would you give someone who's thinking about doing the same thing? I'll come to you first, Phil, on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Svetlana would agree. So I think we could say that the initial sort of learning curve is steep. I think when you're moving and sort of reconceptualizing something that you do, that's quite a big shift. But I would say that it is also worth the time and effort that you put into that. There's a payoff, I think, from that initial trying to get to speed with how things work. What are you conceptually trying to do? How is it different from what you were doing before? That sort of work is, it's a lot, but I think it's quite worthwhile. And I think we've already touched on this before, but I think what's really helped us is being involved with other institutions who have slightly different cases to ours. I mean, ours is quite specific to international students, where we have a need to assess students both in the UK and elsewhere, and sometimes at the same time on the same test, which I can't imagine how we would go about doing that without this sort of move to digital assessment that we've been involved in. But I think the key thing is working with others, reaching out to others. I think Inspira, people at Inspira have been very helpful when we've had lots of questions about how does this bit work? Can we do this? And I know there are a lot of things in the pipeline. Quite sort of when suggestions are made, these are sort of listened to. You don't get an instant thing that changes, but people are considering these things, and sort of later down the line, you actually find that we'd like to have more statistics to kind of see what's going on. And a few months later, there is now a sort of dashboard that you can use. These sort of things. I think reaching out to others, sharing questions, sharing stories, and trying to share successes. Sometimes I think making people aware of the work that's gone in. You've done something that's changed things quite positively, and you should be able to celebrate those and tell others about them as well.
Absolutely, we want to share those with you. So that's really, really important. Svetlana, lessons that you've learned that you can share with others.
I think I would like to add to what Phil has been saying about the steep learning curve, and maybe allowing yourself the time and being kind to yourself, because it will take time to familiarize yourself with the tools available, but also keeping an open mind, because, for example, our case was working with a very well established case. So our team designs the test of English for educational purposes. So it's an academic proficiency test that was initially developed by the great Cyril Weir, and then later developed by Barry O'Sullivan, and we are now kind of continuing the legacy. So we had to think about how do we best adapt the a well-established test, and basically looking at the tools available and looking at the test specifications and keeping an open mind about what can be enhanced through digital assessment. But also, equally, if you're working on a completely new test, it's allowing yourself time to learn what the system has to offer, and then thinking about the target skills you're trying to assess. I think apart from the assessment design itself, I think what we've learned, it was really important that we engaged with the key stakeholders right at the start, because we had to make sure that we are compliant with our university legal requirements, the data protection rules, and things like that. So having those kind of stakeholders supporting and following the project has been really, really beneficial for us. So hopefully it will lead to a greater acceptance of the software. Another thing I think that really, really helped us with our pilot was assembling a team with a very wide range of skills. We were lucky enough to have tiny fractions of a few assessment specialists, a few administrative support staff, and a learning technologist. So I don't think that we would have been able to pull it off, because it's a quite small scale departmental pilot. So having a range of skills represented was really, really helpful for us. I think those are probably the key skills. And also, as Phil said, the importance of dissemination and continuous engagement with stakeholders, because it's quite easy to get bogged down with the nitty gritty and kind of not keep everyone up to date on what you're doing. I think these are probably best tips of advice we
Yeah,
can offer.
absolutely. And it's great to hear because we've seen the success of projects at institutions, particularly where they bring in those differing skills and stakeholders. It's that wonderful mesh of the person who understands the assessment well, the person who understands learning and teaching really well, learning design being a separate point, learning technologists bringing some of that together. That teamwork really does make a huge difference. So, takes me to my final question, which is asking you both to share an example of where Inspira has transformed either your assessment or your assessment practices at Reading, and appreciating you've only been doing it for a year, but something that it's made that difference. Phil, to you first, if I might.
There's probably a couple of things I could talk about. Maybe one of them Svetlana might take. I mean, I think I've mentioned already the particular thing for us. We're finding that typically assessment has been students on campus, perhaps in a room somewhere, centrally timetabled. But for a centre or a school like ours, what we're seeing more and more is this real internationalisation, what we might call transnational education, where we're sort of going to where the students are. So we have campuses in Malaysia, partner institutions in China, in South Africa, in various places, and so very often what we're being asked to do is to assess students who aren't in the UK, but maybe taking the same test as the students who are in the UK. And so, this I think has been a big sort of shift for us. And I think very difficult to sort of think how we would go about doing that without the tools that we now have that we can sort of work through. And I feel this might be something that happens more and more in the future, that there's more, as sort of numbers of international students coming to the UK seems to be shrinking, whether or not more institutions will now go to where the students are at. And if they're doing that, then how they're going to sort of assess fairly, make comparable judgments with students who are at the UK institution. I think there's going to be more and more of that. And I think that's something that, again, will will grow. But that's certainly one thing I would talk about. The other thing, perhaps just very quickly, would be the academic integrity process. I think has shifted quite a lot in terms of not the actual process itself, but how we go about looking at student work and seeing if there's been any academic misconduct. This last year, we had a few cases of students who we felt the writing wasn't their own work necessarily, but having access to the tools, the proctoring logs, we were able to make pretty strong cases as to why we had our suspicions and why we felt that there was some misconduct there. And so I think that whole process has been enhanced, and certainly our Director of Teaching and Learning has found the process has been enhanced because they can handle the misconduct panels much more easily now with being able to see footage for themselves and be able to potentially show that to students.
Yeah, I can see the big difference there. Svetlana, over to you.
I think I just wanted to say that Phil's being very modest there. He's done an enormous amount of work on the academic misconduct processes and liaison with our school director of teaching and learning. I think that there's a lot of credit that needs to go to Phil on this.
It's noted and now broadcast to the world, which is important. So
Great. Yeah, and I can add that I think having the tools available in Inspira, I think it has helped us to enhance the quality of our digital assessment, because it hasn't been the first year we have done digital assessment. I think just like everyone else during COVID, we had to move our assessments online, but we had some limitations that kind of meant we had to compromise on how well we were able to represent the target construct and things like that. So I think, like, to give an example of reading assessments we weren't able to display the prompts alongside questions, so the students were probably using different cognitive processes when they were interacting with these prompts to those that we were using or they were using when they were doing paper-based tests. So we feel like we are able to create assessment conditions that are more comparable to the paper-based administration, so we're able to support our claims about the equal value or meaning of those scores, for instance. Or we are also able to create more I would say, more comparable or fair conditions for assessments of listening, where we're able to control the number of replays that students are allowed. So we are confident that those scores that they're receiving on listening assessments are comparable. And I think in terms of user experience, I think students have benefited greatly from having the EDI accommodation tools, such as being able to resize the fonts or to change the color of the background. I think we've had some really great feedback from students. And in terms of assessment security, I think just having the greater confidence in the security of the assessment also helps us to make inferences about the meaning of those scores, because we deal with very high stakes assessments.
That's all really pleasing to hear. And I mean, all of them, in particular, the student feedback is always great. They're ultimately the consumer of that assessment, and the person who has a real stake in the outcome of it. So that's really, really pleasing to hear in the way that they're able to interact with it. Well, that's it for our discussion today. Thank you, Phil and Svetlana, for joining me. It's been really fascinating hearing about what the University of Reading has been up to. I wish you, of course, continued success, and we're here to work with you. And thank you to our listeners. If you found this useful, please like, subscribe and share, as every podcast asks you, via your preferred podcast platform. And if you've got time, leave us a quick review. They're always appreciated. Phil, Svetlana, anything that you want to plug or you want to mention, or anything you want to say right at the end?
No, we just wanted to thank you for having us on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. The podcast is only a thing with the guests who come on, so I'm delighted you both made the time to do it. I'm going to be speaking, I'm going to plug myself, I'm going to be speaking at events this year in Lancaster, in Spokane, in Washington State, and in Hong Kong. But wherever you are, whether it's one of those events or just online, it's pretty easy to find me. I'd be delighted to talk to you about digital assessment, academic integrity, flexibility, or any of those topics. So that's all of our time for today. Assessment in Focus is brought to you by Inspira, providing flexible assessment with integrity. I've been Ishan and I will see you next time.